This is Demetrius Spinrad.
And this is Isaac Meyer.
And you're listening to Criminal Records, a podcast about some of the weirdest cases in true crime history.
That's right. And today we're going back. Not back to the future, but back just to the past this time. I should have cleaned that up a little bit more in my head. Whatever. We're going to roll with it.
Speaking of cleaning things up, what we are doing is re-recording one of our episodes that, let's say, had some audio problems.
Yes, I believe this was the infamous Metatron episode, where I fully ascended into, according to whatever we were using to record at this point, someone with 3 different heads, which were all talking simultaneously.
I truly do not know how you managed to do that, but that was probably some of the worst audio we've ever produced. And we produced some bad audio in our day.
I think it's my greatest accomplishment as a podcaster, personally.
I think that was the moment where I realized that I had to start editing the podcast and not you.
So we are going back to one of our very earliest Criminal Records episodes on the husband and wife duo, Xilai and Kailai. And if you have not heard their story before, it's a pretty interesting one that both reveals something about the modern Chinese criminal justice system and is a bit of an entree into the world of the wild politics of the Communist Party today. So I think it makes for a great story, and I'm excited to make it accessible once again to the people.
Oh boy. All right. So where are we starting today?
Okay, well, of course, before we get into our story, we must naturally offer a little context. And this context primarily is about the Communist Party itself. And one of the things I think is really important to understand about the Chinese Communist Party, this is really true of any one-party state or any party that is incredibly politically dominant, is that by definition, it kind of has to be a big tent. If the party is going to be that dominant, it has to bring in people from a wide variety of backgrounds.
Now, if there's one thing I know about communists, they never argue over the finer points of policy and have any kind of schisms whatsoever.
Yes, a famously tolerant political ideology when it comes to dissent, particularly in the People's Republic of China under Chairman Mao, a man known for his toleration of dissenting viewpoints and not for shipping those people off to labor camps in the countryside. So the Communist Party in China really is divided historically into 2 main wings, right? The first are Mao and his immediate followers, who are much more ideological. They are like hardcore Maoists who are very doctrinaire about their politics and having those politics sort of follow the line that Mao lets out. The other wing of the party, I would call them the technocrats of the Communist Party, who are still communists. I want to be clear about that. They believe in the Communist Party, but they are not as ideological as Mao and his backers are. They are much more concerned with kind of effective policy, economic growth, and how that can be used to kind of further the long-term goals of the Communist Party. Right? So Mao, a pretty ideological man, I think it's fair to say, who, of course, is more or less the dominant force in the party from the time it takes over China to the time of his death in 1976, with a few interim years in there. But after Mao dies, his immediate successor, a fellow ideologue named Hua Guofeng, was not really a particularly adept politician, and so within a few years he is forced out of power by someone from the technocratic side of the party, a man by the name of Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping and his political allies will come to dominate the next couple decades of China's development, and he is the one, more than anyone, who's really responsible for what we call the economic miracle in China. He has a couple of famous phrases associated with him. One of the big ones is, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice," which is a nicely poetic way of saying, I don't really care so much about whether a policy fits a given ideology. I care whether it works and will make China richer and stronger than it is today. And that worked out pretty well. China is a lot less poor than it used to be. It is now the world's 2nd largest economy, if you have not been following the news for the past 15 years. So that cat caught some mice, I guess you'd say. That cat ran over some protesters with a tank in Tiananmen Square, but we don't worry about it.
I was just going to say, I recall this being a period of Chinese history in which some choices were definitely made.
Yeah, definitely Deng Xiaoping. The way I've often heard it described is that before him, the Maoist system was still pretty Stalinist, and that what Deng Xiaoping essentially offers to China is I will liberalize the economy. I will liberalize that specific sector of Chinese life and a little bit of the kind of social world. And in exchange, you, all the people of China, will accept the continued rule of the Communist Party. That was kind of the grand bargain he offered. And I would say it's worked out pretty well for most people in China. Certainly, there's a growing wealth disparity in the country that was not there under Mao, but it is also hard. Like, as far as I know, the economic reforms of Deng Xiaoping have lifted more people out of poverty than any other government like reform in the history of humanity. So, you know, that's something.
You win
Uh,
some, you lose some protesters.
yeah, I think the ethics of that are something else.
Or
But
should
I
I
think,
say, you win some, you disappear some.
I mean, it's something I definitely like. I have strong ethical views about the Communist Party. You've heard them before if you listen to this podcast. And also, I do want to be fair about like there is a reason the party is still popular in China, and it does still rule the country. Anyway, fast forward to the year 2012. The technocrats still dominate China's government, and the heir apparent to the nation's leadership, Xi Jinping, at this time a young up and comer, is a technocrat as well. But there is still a Maoist wing within the Communist Party. And at the time, it is most associated with the party secretary for the major city of Chongqing by the name of Bo Xilai. Right? So Bo has a very interesting backstory of his own. His father is named Bo Yibo, and Bo Yibo was one of the so-called eight immortals of the Communist Party, which is a reference to the eight immortals of Chinese mythology. But in this case, they are politicians who were around for a very long time within the party and became very high status and influential. Bo Yibo joined the Communist Party at 17 in 1925. He lived to be 99, and he worked for he was a leader in the Communist Party from the time he was 17 until he was 99.
Oh my God.
Yeah, he had some cred. He spent 5 years in a nationalist prison. The Nationalist Party were the previous rulers of China. Spent 13 years in the Chinese Red Army, what's now the People's Liberation Army, and served a whole host of roles in the government. The guy, like, he believed in the Communist Party, and he really like worked hard for it. And he didn't always get paid back terribly well for that. He actually, during the height of the Mao years, during the Cultural Revolution, was put in prison as a technocrat and revisionist for 10 years alongside his children, including Bo Xilai, who was in his 20s at that point. But once Deng Xiaoping takes over in the mid to late 70s, he gets brought back and becomes a close ally of Deng's, as is Bo Xilai. We'll see this in a moment, but Bo Xilai's ideology is a little hard to pin down. But because Bo Xilai is the son of this guy who like is one of the legends of the Communist Party, he is often what we referred to as what we call a princeling. He's part of the kind of the communist elite, the children of these kind of high level communist families, who arguably gets where he is. We'll see, he's not an untalented politician, ethically something else, but the man has a talent for politics. But arguably also he got where he did because he was related to a very famous Communist Party leader.
Okay, so kind of a Kennedy situation where the family has been in politics for a while, but also they are producing their fair share of actually talented and charismatic politicians.
I think that's a good comparison. The People's Republic of China, obviously a comparatively new government, so you don't have quite the kind of long form history. And for the Bo family, for reasons we'll talk about, that history probably ends with Bo Xilai. But I think that comparison still works, absolutely. So Bo Xilai got his start in the party in kind of the 80s, really. When he gets out of prison in the end of the mid 70s, he goes to school, gets a BA from Beijing University, a master's from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and officially joins the Communist Party in 1980. Not everyone in China is a member of the Communist Party. It's actually like a decent social distinction to be a party member. You have to apply. You have to be like a good student to get in. You don't just get in automatically. But Bo Xilai probably did not get in purely on his merits. I think his family history helped a little bit. And he was able to jump directly into the kind of headquarters of the party, which is located in Zhongnanhai, a neighborhood of Beijing. So he spends a few years there at kind of the party headquarters, not somewhere you just jump to if you're some dipshit off the street, and then gets a transfer into the provincial government, which is kind of the place. China has very strong provincial governments. Even under the Communist Party, it's more centralized than it used to be. But China is very big. You're probably aware if you've ever looked at a map. So even for a pretty centralized, strong bureaucracy like the Communist Party, you need to have a degree of local independence for the regional parties, because it's just too much for a centralized party to fully manage.
So is this a federal system like the United States, or do you still have the national system, but then you have more independent local governments?
I would say it's still a national system with independent local governments. The national party theoretically can always overrule the local party. In practice, local parties tend to be very entrenched, and so they do have a lot of influence that requires the national party often to kind of negotiate the kind of local scene a little bit. A famous example here is environmental reform. The National Communist Party is very worried about the environment because China is very vulnerable to climate change and also has a giant population that could be displaced by climate change. And so actually has had a lot of regulations around protecting the environment for a very long time. But getting local parties to listen to that, when that means maybe cutting ties with prominent local businesses that the local party elite have a very nice relationship with, has been a bit more of a challenge. But it also means provincial government is a good place to prove yourself. So the big one for Bo Xilai is the northeastern city of Dalian in the 90s to the early 2000s. Dalian is a large port, but not a terribly wealthy one, and he does an incredible job really turning Dalian around, particularly by soliciting investment from South Korea and Japan, while also doing a big environmental cleanup in the city to make it just nicer to live, because that part of China had big pollution problems up till, well, it still does, but they've gotten better recently. And so the Dalian success story allows him to continue to climb up the ranks of the party. He's briefly the commerce minister, which in a growing economy, kind of a big deal. And he also is able to secure a lovely little marriage for himself to one Gu Kailai, who is, among other things, a very accomplished lawyer and businesswoman herself. She is also from an elite family. Her father was a prominent general in the People's Liberation Army. So also like of status in the party, a princessling, I guess, if he's a princeling, a power couple, a communist power couple.
So these folks seem like they have it made. I mean, they are definitely on a trajectory to success. What could possibly tempt people who have it all already to commit crimes?
Well, I guess the thing with having it all is you can always have more of it all. And for Bo Xilai, his opportunity for that comes in 2007. So, as we all know, of course, the Chinese Communist Party has big party congresses every 5 years, in the second and seventh year of each decade. 2007 is the 17th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. And this is kind of the reshuffle moment in the party. It's when new policies get announced, new leaders get kind of premiered, people retire, others move up the ladder. Obviously, this is not equivalent to a national election in the US. It's not very transparent why things happen. There is a whole cottage industry of party congress prognosticators who are trying to psychically intuit what is happening within the party based on like what is shown in the party congresses. But it's kind of the one moment of transparency in the party, and particularly after Deng Xiaoping, it's when the leadership rotates. He was very big on avoiding Mao-like figures who dominate the party for a very long time and rotating leadership to try and make for a more effective, less personality-driven system. So in 2007, Bo Xilai, he's the hot name on everyone's lips. He's done all this great stuff. And so he gets an appointment to the Politburo, the political bureau of 25 people who runs the Communist Party. Pretty good deal. He's not put on the standing committee, which is the kind of inner circle of the Politburo that actually like manages their decisions. But he's like officially one of the top 25 hottest communists in the communist and the Chinese communist world. So, not bad.
If there's one thing I know from covering several communist cases, it's that drama over who is on which committee is about to blow everything up.
Oh yeah, and I mean this really here's some hot Communist Party gossip for you. So at the same time he's put in the Politburo, he gets taken off of the Commerce Ministry and sent to the city of Chongqing, which is China's largest interior city, to act as the party secretary. So this is a city that, because it's one of the biggest ones in the interior, is kind of central to the kind of interior Chinese economy. It also has a lot of issues with pollution, unemployment, health problems, because of its kind of economic centrality in a manufacturing economy. The hot gossip when this happens is that the then president of China, Hu Jintao, his political ally had been the party secretary of Chongqing. His name is Wang. And things in Chongqing, again, not going super hot. So the theory is that Wang Yang is being reassigned to get him out of Chongqing, because if he stays there and things continue to not be great, it looks bad for President Hu Jintao. And instead, Bo Xilai is just being chucked under the bus. Like, this guy, he doesn't really have any close political allies. His father's dead at this point. So we can just kind of chuck him in there and he'll either figure it out or we can just blame it on him.
So Bo Xilai does an amazing job of cleaning up a port city, and instead of being rewarded for that success, he gets chucked into an interior city that has a really, really long history of mismanagement, is told, clean it up, or, you just won't be very relevant as a political figure. We'll just sort of heap the blame on you.
Absolutely. So it's a political challenge, but it's also an opportunity. Chongqing is the 7th largest city in China. It is, as far as I know, and I'm not an expert on the modern Chinese economy, the most important city that is not a coastal port. So, kind of a big deal. And if Bo Xilai can turn it around, this is a great chance to prove that he's a valuable leader, if he's looking 5 years ahead, right? Because in 2012, there's going to be the 18th Party Congress, right? He maybe will have a chance to turn around Chongqing by then. And in 2012, because of the rotation system that's now in effect, all but 2 members of the standing committee are slated to retire. So there's going to be a lot of openings for, say, an ambitious young guy in the Politburo who's already done pretty well for himself to slot up to the top spot.
Oh, I see. Okay, so this is his sink or swim moment where maybe he gets a chance to be on the good committee.
Absolutely. And by the standards of the Communist Party, and I really want to emphasize that, he swims, at least at first. He swims pretty hard. So he implements sweeping reforms as party secretary for Chongqing to try and really increase the livability of the city that for a time are held up as the Chongqing model, the future of the Communist Party, at least in terms of reform and especially in these kind of more polluted cities. So first, sweeping programs for infrastructure and public housing. These are all paid for with profit from new industries, which Bo Xilai would build up in Chongqing by doing what he did in Dalian, courting foreign investment as much as he possibly can. And he is really good at this. In 2007, there's about $1 billion of foreign investment in Chongqing. By 2011, the year before the party congress, it's up to $11 billion. So $10 billion increase in 4 years? Is that right? I'm great at math.
That is a lot of money. Yeah, even by the standards of, I think that was a particularly busy time for some foreign outsourcing. Even by those standards, that much money ending up in one city is a lot.
Absolutely. And Bo Xilai very smartly makes sure to spread those profits around, again, with like social programs, building up housing. So the people of the city benefit as well, not just the rich. And while he's doing all of this, he's also very strictly enforcing the environmental regulations the city has, which again are not, they're strong theoretically across China. How evenly they're enforced place to place is questionable. He's also very active in combating the city's organized crime problem. Chongqing is a long-standing home of Chinese organized crime. By implementing a close political ally of his, Wang Lijun, to be the police chief, and to aggressively go after the city's criminal class. What he will do, his anti-gang campaign, basically involves taking advantage of the complete lack of protection under the law for accused suspects by arresting anyone who even might vaguely have a tie to a gang, and then basically holding them more or less indefinitely until they crack and give something to the police.
You know what? When you're not too worried about people's civil rights, you can do a lot really fast.
Yeah, I mean, he works through potential suspects very quickly and does do a good job wrapping up the crime problem in the city. But he also, astonishingly, I know this will shock you, Demetria, as the deep idealist that you are, maybe uses this to go after some of his political opponents as well. For example, arbitrary arrests of people who are involved in like labor organizing in the city that might raise costs and drive away foreign investors. I found a really good quote from a lawyer in the court system who had worked for some of these defendants, Lijun, who says of Xilai, many Chongqing residents feel the city is safer and more beautiful now, but Germany under Hitler was the safest in its history.
That is certainly a use of defaulting to using Hitler in an argument that I haven't heard quite that angle before.
Yeah, I mean, I do question some of Li Zhuang's historical analysis, not the least of all because you are kind of leaving aside the whole Germany getting bombed flat under Hitler's rule. And also, a few other things. It was safer maybe for some people in Germany. But you kind of get you get the comparison that's being drawn there.
I understand. It's a trains run on time kind of comparison.
Indeed.
I must say here, I am throwing stones from a bit of a glass house here as an American who has watched certain movements not necessarily be treated particularly well by my own government. But yeah, this seems like a pretty egregious violation of people's human rights here.
I mean, throwing stones from glass houses is a time-honored American tradition. That's what this country was founded on, goddammit.
God bless America.
So one of the biggest cases from this time, there's a high-level public servant who had worked for the city government for 16 years, who is found to have engaged in corruption, graft, essentially stealing money from the public coffers, who is put in a very high-profile trial and then sentenced to death. This is kind of side-eyed by some of the party leadership who are like, this guy, okay, he broke the rules, but he gave a lot of service to the party. Maybe, you want to kind of factor that into the punishment. But in China today, there's a lot of concern around corruption, right, which is a major issue in terms of the fairness of the distribution of the fruits of economic growth. And so the decision to just execute this guy is very popular among the kind of average residents of the city who see this as like, oh, finally, we're taking corruption seriously.
So is this guy not just going after all corruption? He's going specifically after the allies of the previous manager of the city?
He tries to play it as going after corruption in general. As we will see, he was not above a little corruption himself. So I think it's fair to say it's not an evenly distributed program. Let's call it that. One of the things I find really interesting about Xilai is also that while he's doing all of this, he implements sweeping social policies in Chongqing, most of which, even though he's kind of courting economic growth, are very Maoist. So, for example, he starts this kind of system of bringing back Maoist propaganda in Chongqing to kind of promote this idea of personal self-sacrifice and giving it all for the community. He's big into what he calls the Sing Red campaign, where the city's PA system, all cities in China have PAs everywhere, plays old patriotic and Maoist songs from the Cultural Revolution period on regular intervals. He will play revolutionary TV shows or some of the old revolutionary operas on state TV channels. These were operas created by Mao's fourth wife, former subject of the podcast Jiang Qing, to promote good communist morals. He brings back an old favorite of mine, the Study Lei Feng campaign. Lei Feng was a soldier in the People's Liberation Army who got killed in an accident in the 1960s. And then supposedly his diary was found, and it had all these things about, oh, I just love the people of China and I want to sacrifice for them, and I love the party and Chairman Mao. And it became this whole kind of propaganda exercise of like, read Lei Feng's diary and study Lei Feng, do what he did. There's some question about A, how Lei Feng actually died, and B, how genuine the diary is. But he brings back the study Lei Feng thing, which is very like, it's very 1960s.
Okay, so he is on this mission to make China great again.
Yes, definitely. To make China great again, as Mao wanted to make China great again. He also sprinkles Mao quotes into his speeches, which, to be fair, are a mandatory part of the classroom curriculum. I am told by students from China that they spend a lot of time memorizing Mao's old speeches. Some of them can still recite a few from memory, even after they've been in the U.S. for several years. And he'll bring back some Maoist social safety net policies, state housing for the poor, kind of red GDP programs, he calls them, that share out dividends from the city's profits among its residents. There's an open question whether like Bo was genuinely ideologically Maoist, or if he just saw this as a way to kind of boost his own popularity by taking what he knew were kind of wedge issues in the party, which were the kind of concerns around sharing of economic growth and average people benefiting from it, and playing on them as much as he could.
So, okay, so this is definitely a guy who's going for the populist angle.
Absolutely. He's a big populist. And he loves to play that image in person too. So, for example, in 2008, there's a big taxi cab strike by the city's taxi drivers. And his response to that is not a crackdown. He says, let's go on TV together and sit down and let's just talk out these issues. Right? It's kind of a moment of like, he just lays on the charm very thickly and breaks the strike up just by being like, I hear you and I'll help you because I'm one of the people. I'm a servant of the people, just like you.
So I have a question here. I have heard of a lot. I mean, we are in an era of rising populism, but specifically the Chinese Communist Party system seems like a populist coming up the ranks might be a bit of a threat to some of those guys in the committees up top. So how is the National Party handling the popularity of the guy that they were trying to throw to the wolves?
Oh, so this is a complicated one, right? He is publicly praised by a lot of people who see how popular what he's doing is and kind of want to ride those coattails. Xi Jinping, who is slated to take over the leadership of the party in 2012, is one of those people. He praises Bo Xilai and says, like, this is a good model. He's showing that he cares for the people. There are others who are maybe a bit less favorable to that for exactly the reasons you're talking about. So, for example, Bo Xilai, what he's doing is very much a contrast to the previous party secretary, Wang, who is more of a, like, let the businesses do what they want. I don't care about, equal distribution of growth. And the fact that Bo Xilai is reversing a lot of those policies means that Wang Yang's political allies, including the then party president Hu Jintao, do not like him very much. They see him as a little populist, maybe a little getting a little too Maoish in some of what he's doing, and just kind of throwing the party under the bus to boost his own popularity.
Isn't there sort of a complex relationship with how much of what Mao did is now considered a good idea in China?
No, he was 70% good and 30% bad. That is the official party standard.
I remember you coming back from when you were working and studying in China, and you had some very helpful language guides assigned to you by the government who really wanted to make sure you knew the exact percentages of how good and bad Mao was.
To be fair, this is the official policy of the Chinese government that Mao was 70% good and 30% bad. Not 69-31, not 71-29, 70% good, 30% bad. I mean, it's complicated, right? Because he is the founder of the country. He's like the George Washington of communist China. And yet, that Cultural Revolution stuff, it wasn't great. There are some people for whom that did not work out super great. And trying, how you manage that, I think, is challenging for communist governments. I mean, arguably, that's what did the Soviet Union in, was that, like, you couldn't really kind of contain the ideological damage of Stalinism to just Stalin, right? A lot of that reflects badly on Lenin, too, and on the folks who came after Stalin. And when Gorbachev starts to liberalize discussion around that, it kind of undermines the ideological foundations of the whole system. And so, the 70-30 Mao thing sounds dumb, but it also kind of helps protect the legitimacy of the system by shutting down any kind of more awkward, nuanced conversations around Mao's actual legacy.
I'd say some other things also undermined the Soviet Union.
Well, okay, one of many problems with the Soviet Union. But it's fair to say, I think, at the start of 2012, Xilai, he's pretty popular. Again, the people who don't like him in the party leadership, but he's still, he's a hard man to push against because he has this popular following, probably a shoo-in for the standing committee, especially given the number of openings, especially given that his chief ideological critic, who is Hu Jintao, is also slated to retire at the 18th Party Congress. So that's going to open up some room there. But then it all goes to shit. So let me paint you a mind picture. It's February 6th, 2012. The American Embassy in Chongqing. Bo's chief of police, Wang Lijun, bursts through and he says, "I need protection from the U.S. government. My life is in danger. Please give me asylum."
Oh boy. Okay, that is an exciting twist. How did that happen?
Well, we had denied him asylum, actually, and then booted him out of the embassy, and then he was arrested by the Chongqing City Police, which he was previously the head of. It turned out Wang Lijun was worried that Bo Xilai was out to get him because of a wild tale that he then tells to the Chinese security officers who take him into custody. So, what Wang says is that he was party to an incident between Bo Xilai's wife, Gu Kailai, and a foreign national, a Brit by the name of Neil Haywood. So Haywood is an old friend of Bo Xilai and his wife, Gu Kailai, and is kind of like a fixer for them, essentially. Particularly working with Gu Kailai, he will reach out to foreign companies and be like, "Hey, you know where a great place to invest is? Chongqing. I've got connections with the party secretary. I can get you a sweet deal. And, come invest in the city." Companies come. Haywood gets a cut of basically the profits from this in exchange for facilitating it. It's a pretty tidy arrangement, but in November 2011, Haywood and Gu Kailai apparently got into a dispute over this. It's not quite clear over what. I assume just like distribution of profits, who gets what. And Haywood goes to Chongqing at Gu Kailai's invitation to smooth things over, work out a more profitable relationship. We're old friends here. We can be mature about this. They have tea together at a local hotel. It all seems like it's going great, except that then a few days later, Neil Haywood, who is not a heavy drinker, is found dead in his hotel room. The case is pronounced as alcohol poisoning. He's died based on because of alcohol poisoning. No autopsy. Body gets cremated immediately.
Ooh, this is starting to seem a little suspicious to me.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that Gu Kailai did poison him, of course, with cyanide, El Clasico, and that Wang Lijun is the chief of police and helps her cover it up. But then Gu Kailai starts, frankly, I mean, I've never tried to cover up a murder that you all know of, but in my unprofessional view, starts making a few mistakes. She's very worried about trying to suppress evidence of what happened after the fact. So, for example, she'll put pressure on the hotel staff who saw her and Haywood together and be like, "You need to transfer out of Chongqing," to kind of try and cover this all up. Wang Lijun starts to argue with her and be like, "Hey, when you do this, it's a little sus, It's a little weird that you're very invested in these transfers and it's drawing attention to us where there wouldn't otherwise be any."
Okay, so the chief of police is in on this because he's advising her on what to do to not be suspicious.
Exactly. So Bolshilai knows about this whole dispute, apparently, according to later revelations, and basically takes Gu Kailai's side and is like, you should do what my wife says, move these people away, cover it all up, right? And then a few people who also know about this, kind of close followers of Bolshilai's, also start to get arrested on corruption charges. Wang Lijun is very concerned that this is Bolshilai and Gu Kailai also cleaning up the loose ends, hence the whole running to the US embassy and being like, let me in, I'm afraid for my life.
And you did say that corruption charges come with the death penalty, right? This is not the slap on the wrist that corruption charges often are in the States.
Yes, in theory, you can get a suspended sentence if the court thinks there's reason for good behavior. Essentially, that means if you stay on the straight and narrow for a certain number of years, the death penalty gets waived. But that probably would not happen here.
Okay, so this is a pretty serious threat on his life.
Yes, but the fact that Wang Lijun runs into the U.S. embassy, which is tightly observed by the Chinese government, as are many embassies around the world, means that when he comes out, the parts of the state security service that are not subservient to Bolshilai, they work for the National Party, also know that some shit is up. Because that raises some alarm bells when a senior local cop runs into the embassy demanding asylum.
So, do we have any records of why the U.S. Embassy wouldn't grant him asylum?
That I don't know, actually. I assume they were a little worried about the potential political blowback of getting involved in this. We don't really have a national vested interest in dealing with China's corruption issues. So I would assume they're just like, not our scene, not our issue.
We should probably do some cases on the politics of asylum because they are fucking weird.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. And I got to say, I don't feel that bad for Wang Lijun. It's not like he had any moral objections to poisoning someone. He just had moral objections to being killed too. Which, fair enough, but you can't really complain in that case. Anyway, this allegation, especially when Wang Lijun then tells all of this to the state security agents who come looking for him, it blows up, right? Bolshilai is accused of illegally using his power to harass his political and business opponents. He's accused of basically conspiracy and covering up this murder. He is removed as party secretary of Chongqing as a result in March of 2012, kicked off the Politburo in April, and then he is brought up on charges of corruption and murder alongside both Wang Lijun and his wife Gu Kailai. So, a very rapid fall from grace.
Oh boy. Okay, so is some of this fall from grace perhaps engineered by some of his political opponents, or is this actually a case where everyone involved in this prosecution is on the straight and narrow, is actually like, hey, dude, you cannot be murdering people?
I suspect personally, and this is the thing where we just don't know because it's kind of an internal party decision and there's no transparency there. There is a little column A, a little column B there. Like, it's pretty clear to me Bolshilai and Gu Kailai did a turbo shady shit. They almost certainly did kill Neil Haywood and, definitely did abuse their positions for their own ends. On the other hand, that's not unique to the two of them. It's a major problem in the Communist Party. And one suspects that maybe this is an attempt, particularly by folks like Xi Jinping, who are slated to step up into party leadership roles, to take a potential political opponent, a rival from power, off the chessboard, so to speak, by kind of seizing the opportunity that's presented here.
So how does this trial end up going?
All right, so it may surprise some of you to know that the People's Republic of China does have a functional court system. There are trials there. There were also trials in the Soviet Union. Communist states really like having a court system because it lends the things they do an air of legitimacy. Mao personally did not like courts. He thought they were a bourgeois institution, as we've talked about. But they were revived as an institution during the post-Mao era. And now, have a long history. There's a legal profession in China. There is like a criminal code and a civil code.
It's also, shall we say, foreign investors tend to be willing to overlook a lot of human rights abuses if it is cheap to put factories in a country, but trying to put factories in a country with absolutely no court system might not fly super well.
Yeah, you want at least some property protection so that you have, a chance if the government tries to screw you of enjoying legal protection. So actually that was a big part of it too, was like if we want investment, we need an actual legal system that foreigners can look at and say, okay, this seems like our asses would be covered in at least some cases, so it's worth the risk.
I couldn't do a bunch of Chinese IP cases that I looked up, but they are fascinating. There's some wild stuff going on with Chinese IP law.
Oh, for sure. All right, so judges, the way this works, there is no jury system in China, shockingly enough. Judges are appointed by local governments instead, and all trials are handled by a panel of judges, which is called a collegial panel, usually 3, 5, or 7 judges. So no ties, in essence. Judges can interrogate the defendant. They don't have to be just kind of procedural arbiters. Alongside the state prosecution, they're also allowed to ask questions and kind of push back a little bit. And they vote on the charges, essentially, at the end of the trial. There is an appeals process. There's a whole appeals system. Defendants are allowed to defend themselves, though judges can silence them when they do that. They are allowed legal representation. They are not usually allowed to confront witnesses. Instead, usually witness statements are just read out in court rather than having the witness appear directly. And because of that, cross-examination is also pretty rare. But that's basically how the system works. The trials tend to be short, very efficient. If you're curious about this, I actually, for a very long time, taught lessons on legal reform in China. And I would use a lecture by Dr. Tobias Smith, which he gave to the 1990 Institute, describing the history of the Chinese legal system. He calls it a two-tiered system, where generally the courts are pretty independent on anything that's not vital to state interests. So, if the party damages your property for some reason, you can sue them in a civil court, and you might even win. You have a decent shot of winning. But any trial that has a potential kind of security or state interest connotation, it's pretty easy based on this structure to apply a strategic pressure and ensure the outcome you want.
I see.
Yeah. So Bo Xilai's trial takes place in Jinan, which is on the other end of China from Chongqing. Since, again, judges are locally appointed, the idea is you get him away from any judges he might have appointed and therefore have influence over.
So China doesn't have the same jurisdiction system that the U.S. does for criminal trials?
It does, actually, but in pressing cases, you can move trials if there's an assumption someone couldn't get a fair trial in that locale. In the U.S., we have that rule, too. It's usually to protect defendants from a biased jury. In this case, of course, it is used to protect the prosecution, essentially, from biased judges. So Bo, Gu, and Wang are all put on trial. They all get 3 different trials. Bo's is far and away the largest. It's also the last one. In August of 2013. So it takes a little while to get this together for the state to assemble its case, but that's okay because there's no requirement for a speedy trial under the Chinese system, and you can be held indefinitely. So, that's cool. It is a bit of an unusual one. There are witnesses that are called directly in this case, but it is not unusual in that it's very fast. Would you like to guess how long it took to prosecute Bo Xilai for the crimes of corruption and murder?
I'm going to say a couple days. Does that seem about right for you? Yeah, with a kangaroo court, you don't want to overstay your welcome, but you want to make the headlines for a few days at least.
Absolutely. 5 days. That's what it takes.
Oh, absolutely. I am crushing it at the PR of prosecuting murderers, I guess. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a very fast trial. There's a lot of focus on the corruption angle. There's also the accusation that Bo essentially tries to use his own powers to bolster his political standing. He tapped the lines of Politburo members to try and get the inside gossip on the kind of political happenings. He insists that he did nothing wrong. He actually had confessed while being interrogated, but recants the confession during trial. That probably was a confession extracted under duress, which is not uncommon, especially in high-profile trials in China. But, he'll try to defend himself during the trial. It does not work very well. The government, of course, does accuse him, I think, credibly of being involved in the Haywood case, of abusing his powers. They also try to smear his legacy as much as possible. So there's a whole part of the trial that is utterly unfocused on the actual charges. Instead, it's all about Bo Xilai's son, Bo Guagua. Bo Guagua at this point is in school. I believe he is at Harvard, a place I am sure he got into for utterly legitimate academic reasons and not because Harvard wanted big donations. Because the Ivy Leagues are legitimate institutions that are based entirely on merit.
Tell me how you really feel, darling.
Oh, God, they just wanted his fucking money. It's obvious. Bo Xilai gave his son a lot of money. The prosecution actually tries to turn this around on Bo and basically say, look at all he's doing for his international playboy son. Here are some photos of him having champagne parties in New York. Or, living it up in the high life, using money he got from his father that was taken to corrupt means. Bo Guagua, if you're wondering, has not gone back to China. He lives in Canada now.
I love it when people are corrupt in the dorkiest possible way. Champagne parties.
Rich people, wealth is wasted on the rich. Anyway, so, that has nothing to do with the actual charges, but it looks really bad, right? And so most of this trial, a lot of the coverage is all very anti-Bull. It's trying really obviously to rip his legacy down. Wang and Gu are also, they arrange to testify against him. He claims it's coerced testimony. He also claims that Wang Lijun and Gu Kailai, his wife, were fucking the entire time. I don't know if that's actually true.
I'm not really sure what that adds to his defense, but okay.
I assume that they're they're against him and therefore lying and not credible witnesses. I think he kind of knew which way the wind was blowing and was just trying to cast aspersions to try and save himself. But there was never really any doubt of how this would go, right? So Wang Lijun, the police chief, gets 15 years in prison. Bo Xilai gets life in prison. And Gu Kailai gets a suspended death sentence. So she is given a death sentence because she is directly the one who poisoned Neil Haywood. But, it's a suspended one. With good behavior, it's commuted to a life sentence. And that does officially happen in 2015. She's commuted to a life sentence. And again, speedy trials, 5 days. There is an appeal system. Bo Xilai does ask for an appeal. Initially, it's accepted, but then it's rejected by the Supreme Court of China. And so that's it.
So I'm curious here because it seems like Bo Xilai was executing people for less corruption than this. I mean, this is some grade A corruption. There are bodies involved. So why does the government decide not to execute him in this case?
There's a long and noble tradition of just disappearing politically inconvenient leaders instead of killing them and making them martyrs. And it is true that Bo Xilai is popular still among especially kind of the dissident wing of the party, the neo-Maoists, hard leftists. I don't know how much he genuinely was one, but the fact that he revives some of these Mao era social safety nets, and again, all the, the Sing Red campaign, all of that, makes him popular with these people. And I think there was a worry about martyring him for that cause. By comparison, again, there's a long history of disappearing the inconvenient. So, for example, we made some inopportune Tiananmen Square jokes earlier. You might not know that there was actually a senior Politburo member named Zhao Ziyang who objected to how those protests were handled, wanted to kind of work with the student protesters. And for that reason, he gets disappeared after the events of the Tiananmen massacre, shuffled off and kind of politely retired, and then disappears from the public eye until an announcement a few years later that he had died in a hospital somewhere.
Speaking of cases we probably should do it sometime on this podcast.
Oh, I mean, that would be a really interesting one for sure.
Now that we've pretty firmly established that you are not allowed to lead school trips to China for some of your political statements.
As banned from China as we possibly can be. If a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing all the way. Hashtag Xi Jinping looks like Winnie the Pooh. Yeah. Anyway, Zhao Ziyang, another example of a party leader who is not killed for opposing the party line, but shuffled off politely. I assume that's kind of the same idea with Bull Xilai, right? That you don't want to kill him because it makes him a martyr. You shuffle him off, and then I am sure, nobody knows where he is now. I did look; there's no new information there, but I'm sure one day there will be a small post on China Daily about how he died in a hospital somewhere, and that'll be it. That'll be the last we hear of Bull Xilai if he's not dead already, which is also a possibility. So, I mean, it's interesting to think about this guy because on the one hand, you know, this is a little messy. I think it's fair to say that he got a little railroaded, but he's also not a great dude. I mean, especially among like liberals outside of China, this was actually celebrated because there was a fear that Bull Xilai was taking China back towards a regressive, personality driven politics away from the rule of law, away from kind of this focus on the economy, that he was kind of winding things back to the Maoist side instead of that technocratic line.
I feel like you're building up to a statement about Xi Jinping right here.
Yeah, because he takes over, he takes the top spot, and actually, instead of Bo Xilai, Wang Yang, his old rival, the guy he replaced in Chongqing, is also the one who gets that Politburo spot in 2013. But it turns out that Xi Jinping, I mean, actually has borrowed a lot from the playbook of Bo Xilai since he got pushed out. A lot of anti-corruption purges. So, for example, he famously bounced the former Vice Minister of Public Security, Sun Lijun, for accepting bribes and illegal firearm possession. Doing the same kind of thing of going after senior party leaders, clearing out potential opponents, using corruption as a model. He has also tried to revive kind of red patriotic spirit, not dipping as much into the Maoist well, but still there's a bit of kind of that attempt to ideologically revive the party, to kind of promote this anti-corruption measure, to try and kind of more evenly distribute the growth of China, and to be more overtly ideological in how he does that. Most of us have, I think, at this point, heard about like the weird attempts to outlaw feminine men in China. That was a Xi Jinping original right there. Kind of, no, we need to bring back the rough masculinity of the Cultural Revolution years when men were out doing revolution.
So I have a lot of questions about that because it seems like China, one of China's biggest soft power exports right now, is extremely feminine men.
Yeah, but I think it's kind of classic thing for Xi Jinping. He's more worried about how things play domestically, and is trying to appeal, I think, to kind of an older generation that is more on that kind of weirdly leftist but social conservative Maoist kick. And I think that's pretty similar to Bo Xilai, frankly. The other way to read this really is a potential rival of Xi Jinping being cleared out to kind of open the way for Xi to use that playbook himself to boost his own popularity. I should note, of course, those of you who are keeping track, if the 18th Party Congress was in 2012, the 19th was in 2017, that means the 20th Party Congress was last year, where Xi Jinping also broke the rules and wound things back to the good old Mao days by removing the system that had been in place that required the rotation of the party presidency every 10 years. He's staying in for another term, as many terms as he wants to. First one since Chairman Mao to do that. So another way where he's kind of winding the clock back in this Bull Xilai-esque way. Yeah.
Wow, I wonder if he got that idea from any other world leaders he happens to share a border with.
I'm sure he got that idea from his favorite world leader, who is, of course, Winnie the Pooh.
So this has been really interesting because I feel like there is generally an understanding that populist movements are rising, and some of them are obviously very worrying throughout the world. But I think especially a lot of American media tends to treat it as just kind of a vibe. It's just something in the water. It's just all happening at once. There isn't a lot of digging into how that happens in each country and why it's happening, and some of the roots of why populism is starting to become a big deal internally in various countries' politics. So this was a really interesting look at China, which I feel like I only get some fairly biased Western media takes on China. This was an interesting look at what was going on internally.
I mean, I'm sure that I'm also a bourgeois Western critic of China who, is out to smear the party, or or those are the messages I'll get when this episode goes up. But whatever, I stand by it. Come at me, nerds. In the meantime, if any of our listeners would like to report their political enemies on corruption charges that are totally legitimate, where can they find us?
They can go to our website, facingbackward.com.
You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/facingbackwards, where we will be especially ready to destroy your political opponents for you.
And we also have a Tumblr. We're Facing Backward on Tumblr. I'm not always great about posting there regularly, but once in a while I'll drop a little something on there.
I think you should drop some revolutionary songs on there and promote the Sing Red campaign and how we should all study Lei Feng to become true loyal supporters of the Communist Party.
Isaac, please don't make me listen to more communist songs. I can't take it. I can't take it.
Your hesitancy will be remembered, comrade.
And thank you very much to our patrons who joined at our shout out tier. I want to give them a special shout out because they have so generously supported the podcast. They are Ian Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Kieran Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, an anonymous Anna's hummingbird, a house is a perfectly cromulent mascot, and the fish I catch are Rhodes Scholars compared to Samuel Alito. Schmuck.
Until next time, folks, remember, if you're going to murder anybody, don't be weird about it with the hotel staff, right? Just play it cool. Just play it cool. It's not that hard, people.
You've been listening to Criminal Records, the show that will give you the most advice about doing crimes.